contribution. And I really want to kind of say a few words about that and why such a book is important for our school. So as you know, the Carter School has a history of 40 years, a really amazing legacy. And the school has always been the first in many ways in launching the first PhD program and the MA program in peace studies, in conflict analysis and resolution. Amazing legacy, particularly with the practice of conflict resolution over the last 40 years. The school is home for amazing faculty, and we are very proud of our alumni. So all in all, I mean, I may be a little biased here, obviously, I'm the dean of the school, but, we are in quite an amazing institution and really going for new horizons in the next 40 years. And within that, one of our main drivers that really took place last year with our name change. So we are no longer School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, but we are Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. So the first part of the name, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, I mean, that is just obviously quite fantastic, being able to borrow the names of two great peacemakers of our times is such a pride for us. But the second part, in a very collective way, faculty, alumni, our supporters, our staff, our students, we got together, to think about our name, because it has to really reflect who we are today and also the direction that we would like to have over the next 40 years. And we decided on peace and conflict resolution. And that wasn't accidental at all. The reason for that, I think the work, peace work in terms of conflict prevention, peacemaking, peace building, we really wanted that to be spelled out in our name to reflect who we are. But also it was really important for us to present our commitment on the nexus of peace and justice in terms of who we are, what we do, in terms of our identity. So the reason I'm saying all this is that this book, in a way, is a very good example of who we are today and what we would like to do, because relevance is really important for us. Relevance for conflict-affected communities, disadvantaged neighborhoods, as we focus in this book. And what that means in terms of responding to their challenges, but the kind of like through the prism of conflict analysis and resolution and resilience. So all in all, I think the book really brings so much from the DNA of our school and puts this in a beautiful way, in a very accessible way, to present what the school and our research can do for communities like focusing in this book. So I think for me, that is really an important aspect of this book. And I really congratulate Karina for putting together such an interesting work. And just a couple of other points I'd like to mention, and I'll hand over to our high esteemed speakers in this session. First of all, I think this book does one thing really well, and that is research on disadvantaged neighborhoods. Often look at the problems and challenges and focus on how to address them. I think what this book does, in addition to that, really focuses on positive resilience in a way that communities deal with their problems and addressing them, in very innovative, creative ways. So it really brings the agency of communities and really presents in an accessible way. So I think that is one of the really good qualities, strengths of this book. The second one is that, and that kind of really personal in a way. As you know, the concept of resilience has been, somehow a little bit under attack, in terms of like, the critique of the resilience that kind of talks about the way that kind of transfers the responsibility from governments to communities, and how realistic that is. And to some extent, probably I was pro that kind of critique until I read this book. But what Karina has done here is that each aspect of that critique, she goes and picks up and addresses them patiently, really builds a very strong argument based on field research, lots of really rich stuff coming from her field work, that convinces you that actually positive resilience is a very interesting lens to understand, understand problems of such neighborhoods, but also understanding how valuable their resources, those communities, and what they can do as a partner, as a stakeholder in such environments. So as you see, I really enjoy reading this book, and I think it's a great contribution to the literature. So Karina, congratulations, and thank you for the research and for putting that book together. And with that, over to you. I'm looking forward to the kind of remaining part of this book launch, which this wonderful work deserves so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And again, thank you. I'm so glad to see former students, current students, I hope future students, and a lot of colleagues here online in the room. And before I speak about book, I really also want to say thank you, first of all, to school itself, to this wonderful colleagues I have here, to Dean, because to write book, it's a commitment, and giving us opportunity to work on our own projects, giving us creative way to discuss projects, having the space with my colleague exchange ideas about the book writing is a wonderful, important way. And also students were essential part of this. If you saw the introduction of the book, and we can send more books around, multiple students were part of this project, but multiple students developed as a part of this project. Most of undergrad students, all of them, all enter master programs in the leading universities, and they really learn how to do research doing this. And I had several graduate assistants who helped me. The last one, Mike, is sitting here, who helped shaping the last framing of the book, and exactly as outlined within the critical theory, because it was very important to address all reservations existing in current scholarship about resilience. Another very important thanks to my colleagues here, to Afnan and Bobby, who came here 6 years ago, right, to our school. So let's do something about it. We really want to learn, and slowly, because we didn't have any funding, this project develops, and they were indispensable, commenting on the first draft of the book and changing it in a way how it's really useful for communities, and they don't have more. I also want to say thanks to my husband, who is here today, because without his help and support, and also his design of the book, this book will be a very, very different project. So let me share screen, but again, I don't want to take a lot of, is it like this, right? And then start slideshow. And those who are in online, you can see it, right? People online can see it?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. So very few notes about the, okay. So as Alp very eloquently presented, resilience approach is criticized, and criticized in a way that a lot of people tell, oh, it shifts responsibility from responsible actors, including state, international, World Bank, to local communities. So it's very unethical. There are such discussions. And also they say, if there are risks, so why we should even work in this community, so we know the conflict will occur. And it also might be a lot of resilience negative forms, which we saw in many communities. Communities resist change. They have resilience to particular positive forms of change. But what my idea was for this particular book is really move from this space of describing marginalized groups, marginalized communities as victims. I really wanted to give them agency and voice and show that they are agents of change, that they have produced knowledge on the local level. They have produced actions on the local level. They deserve respect, interest, and active engagement as a real, similar, equal participants of peace building process. And we have to understand the local community possess a lot of knowledge, a lot of skills which were underrepresented, underappreciated, and to understand how we work on multiple levels in building peace in urban spaces, we really have to give communities this particular space. Why disadvantaged neighborhood? And a lot of you know the whole idea of fragility of the state. The state could not deliver resources, could not deliver services, could not provide secure environment. Even in democratic developed societies like United States, there are a lot of pockets of fragility. And these neighborhoods are exactly this pockets where they accumulate the weight of the world. They have a lot of structural inequalities. But also because they are very open and dynamic systems, because they consist of multiple agents, neighborhoods can actually sustain some changes, can create, develop new practices and change, and they're self-organized and self-governed systems. This is self-governance of neighborhoods as communities, again, underappreciated and under-researched. So it's also bring us to ideas that they do produce power, their own power, through production of local knowledge and dealing with conflict dynamic on their specific ways. So the idea was to show how neighborhoods are able to develop, sustain, and further the practices of resilience. So major concept which we develop in this book is perception of resilience as capacity to address conflict and resist conflict, how adapt to particular processes, but also how to transform, and this is the key, transform themselves in this process. So resilience is perceived as a dynamic process designed residents to reclaim their neighborhoods from perpetrators of violence, reduce impact of conflict on their neighborhood, but also create space of well-being for all people. And practices of resilience are perceived as these particular actions which aims to address these three major goals. Through the book, I developed the theoretical concept of four-loop model of resilience. And it helps to see the idea of this particular four loops is to see that every component of resilience, which is structure of conflict, dynamic of identity and power, community capacities, and external resources, are helping to develop practices of resilience, but practices of resilience in their own way change these components of conflict. So I will concentrate quickly on each of these components. And methodology, we did research in 4 neighborhoods in Washington, DC and Arlington. Again, the neighborhoods which were developed by Neighborhood Associates Corporation and their work there. Why this neighborhoods? Not because neighborhood, but also because this neighborhood, thanks to this association, it really brought in change. This, in comparison with other neighborhoods, these neighborhoods show lower level of violence. There are no drug activities in that. As you will see, it's unbelievable what these neighborhoods are doing. So they really differ from neighboring groups around them. So what's they doing? Why they doing this was a major important question. And I had 4 undergraduate assistants who were doing research. They were supervised by a PhD student, and we use phenomenological analysis to analyze all interviews. So first loop is a conflict loop, which is, for me, was very important one. Communities are not only affected by urban violence. I done very deep analysis of all forms of urban violence affecting the neighborhoods, but which include psychological factors like depression and hopelessness. We speak about norms of violence, criminal and drug activity around them. Structural factors like gangs, limited resources, unemployment. But the most important, that neighborhoods are dealing with it. They find ways how in their own way address these issues. And through this second loop, they actually change how not only conflict affects them, but conflict itself. They're able to change the structure of conflict. What they're doing, for example, then they address poverty, they develop community bank. And it's their own initiative. What is really interesting about it, the community bank is used, of course, in situation of crisis and help. But what was very creative, and for me is part of self-esteem, I will speak about self-esteem a lot today. It was very, very interesting because we never thought about how important self-esteem on this topic, how they actually use this community bank in situation of holidays. If somebody has a birthday or somebody has celebration, something happened, child accepted to the college, they celebrate it together. So they use it this community bank for that. Community gardens, it's really helped to get some additional food resources. Employment for youth, it's very strong how communities work together to share information, how people who are responsible for maintenance of community involve young boys and bring them and teach them some skills which will be useful for their employment. Keeping young generation out of street, it was very important. It came from every single interview. How they develop campaign. Parents bring, there's no resources in many cases. Parents just bring children together for campaign. They run sport programs. They have a lot of trips for children in different places. They run summer camp and after school program, run by parents, run parents for other children. And also a lot of them discussing how they do not allow their children to leave gated community after dark. And this is very important. Some of them even discussing to have a security on a gate, not allowing children to leave, not to be engaged with gang activities. So they have security guard and neighborhood watch, and they it's very interesting how they discuss the new policy in DC regarding the use of marijuana. They're not happy with that at all. They're really very critical of it, and they try to not to bring people smoking, not allowing to do it in their own community. So they develop their own marijuana-free spaces where they try not to use it. And community self-esteem is a key. It's very interesting how they clean. Cleaning for many of them, it's very important. They always stress, look how our community is clean in comparison with outside, and you can see it. And they go for cleaning process. It's really keeping community clean. But also one of the very interesting how they address increasing self-esteem is programs which support, for example, unemployed people, or programs which actually support people in Africa. Even they are very marginalized in terms of a disadvantage in terms of salaries, they still collect money or collect like office supplies and send office supplies to children's supplies, school supplies to Africa to help there, increasing very much that they can help. They have a program to support unemployed people. They go in and help people. So there are a lot of activities which help them to deal with factors of conflict. Resource law. Of course, there are a lot of assistance programs. Police, church, education, DC government, they all work in their communities. But it's not very effective. And what came there in these discussions, then they have a very strong policies, for example, collaboration with police. Police are welcome. It was very interesting to hear. They host community meetings. They allow using their community centers for police meetings. They invite them to their own meetings. Police work with children. So there is a very strong bond in this. They also share information. This came as a major issue, how you share information, because there are a lot of programs like $5 cab or something like to go to the doctor. How they use, how you share information, and community work, very importantly to share, try to even post information to help people to get information. Also, they have a lot of community needs and feedbacks of community. They have a lot of concern about gentrification, and they also have a lot of recommendations regarding development. Like they don't need a lot of restaurants, they rather have a laundromats in community. So they have these ideas how it should function. Third loop is a community capacity loop. Usually community capacity perceived as a prerequisite for resilience. So their capacity for resilience. What I found in this research is that, again, it's a very well-developed loop where such capacities as social capital, social support, and collective efficacy constantly reignited, constantly reproduced and developed further through the bonding practices like community meetings. Birthday cards was very important part, which actually Hafna probably will tell how they become implemented in many other places. What's interesting, they have bridging practices for collaboration. They so proud of what they're doing, they go in and teach other neighborhoods about what they're doing. And we're also speaking about how they develop collective decision making. It's a process. So they teach, they address these issues, how to participate in the self-governments. They involve more people, they try to increase more people. It's not formal meetings, it's really meetings which help to develop collective efficacy. And finally, for me, what's most interesting is identity and power loop. Because usually neighborhoods perceived as very homogeneous group. Everyone lives in this neighborhood, they are the same. But for us, it was very important to understand what are microdynamics there. What is how community function. So major factors which we explore how salience of neighborhood identity. So for me, it was interesting to develop the whole theoretical concept of neighborhood identity, what define neighborhood as identity group. And we also speak about public kinship, which Bobby Austin will be speaking because he's in his scholarship, he developed it. Intergroup relations within the groups and also found legitimacy. So what I found that gender dynamics, it's very important. And there are a lot of Girl Scouts, bake sales, women actively participate in all levels of groups. But what we found in boys is men, and especially young boys, become more excluded. And also we found there's a legitimacy of elderly residents. Usually these elderly residents have a lot of trips, a lot of events for themselves, but they're not as interesting for younger people. So if we look about sources of legitimacy, so older people play a very important role. Another very important legitimacy, it's work done for communities. They even have a building named after community organizers, people who done a lot of work for community activists. Historic legacy also important, how long you live in community. And very interesting mother figure. It was very, older women were mostly those who were making decisions about a lot of events, how to spend money, how to develop events. And also we speak about people who overcome difficult past or have a long residency in this process. So what was some conclusion from understanding of identity and power dynamics? That they contribute to self-esteem, collective efficacy as mediators. So they will work in these factors, but also found very strong patterns of exclusion and inclusion. Neighborhood is not monolithical, not homogeneous. We found some groups have more access to resources, more access to decision making. They develop or participate in great amount of practices, while others excluded on the process. So identity dynamics, as many of you, I hope not surprised, plays a key role in even development of neighborhood resilience. And gender and age are two major identity factors. And also legitimacy plays a key role in development of resilient practices. Those who have more legitimacy, they have more say, more opportunity to develop practices, and through these practices, they gain more legitimacy. So it's a very interesting process of reassuring legitimacy of particular agents. So, and practices of resilience constitute and shape identity dynamic within the groups. So what, in the conclusion, I want to show, this is the Rockefeller Foundation model of resilience, like first two circles. And with the board and help with Afnan and Bobby, we were able to bring this particular model and show how our research actually contribute and bring one more level, more micro level for this. It's urban resilience model of Rockefeller Foundation. So we're able to bring more rich information and micro level information to make this model work better as a recommendation for achieving neighborhood resilience. Thank you very much. I try to go very quickly. This is, you know, there is a structural violence incorporated in academic life. You write book for several years and then you have 10 minutes, luxurious 10 minutes to speak about. So thank you very much. And I would like to open a door for several remarks and then for comments and questions. But again, as I told, we have today wonderful two guests who were essential for this work. Afnan Rashid and Bobby Austin. They both represent the leadership of the Neighborhood Associate Corporation. Please.
You're my boss, tell me. As far as I've ever said that. Why don't you go on since you have an idea of what
Good evening, everyone. Let me know if you can hear me as part of the mask. Just want to start off by saying a huge thank you to Karina and all the faculty and staff and students, and especially the resident coordinators at each one of the participating communities, and also the local civic leaders like there. So huge thanks to Saul Reyes, the head of resident services, Akim Bugada, right here in Arlington and Buffalo Village. A gigantic thank you to crises at the Fast Circle, one of the neighborhoods in Marshall Heights. She was able to work with the communities there and with one of the mother figures and several of them through the Fast Circle Tennis Association. Thank you to Karen Follett from Carver Terrace. The community center section you mentioned, right? One of the ones there at Carver Terrace is called the Patsy the Hartsfield Community Center. It was named after an enormous global activist that was there. And of course, just a huge thank you to the overall Paradise or Parkside community resident services team. That's Ms. Tina and Beeks and Ms. Tina Nita Page. They're a mother and daughter pair that have been working and living inside the community for the last 20+ years. So these were the individuals that I was the privilege of getting to walk alongside with and talk about this research project. And one of the biggest takeaways for me was a huge question that came from my previous service as an AmeriCorps Vista was, how do you bridge the resources and knowledge and zeal of energy, rather, of universities that are outstanding like GNU to the community? What are the research questions that you can ask? How can you mutually learn and grow together? So this entire project, took that from the ground up, and especially the idea of asset-based community development when it comes to me. The idea of looking at a community or a neighborhood specifically and saying there's a lot of value already here. What are they doing? How are they demonstrating leadership? And asking and looking more deeply into that piece. In the nonprofit sector, oftentimes we are forced to look at what is a need, what is a demand, what is a specific output or outcome? How can we measure it in sort of statistics or more robustly in a very stringent and hard evidence-based or informed intervention using hard terms and arduousness? And you can never quite convey the immense amount of how much this local informal activity actually helps support a local area, right? So we're chasing after dollars. We have to use their terminology too often, low income, at risk, etc. It's like, no, there's other ways of thinking about this. It could be a fragile community. It could be economically disadvantaged, not earn as much. But look at their human value that they have there. They are doing active things equal and equivalent to any group and area that you have. So for looking at this research project, what did it mean to me? And just paraphrasing some of the items that came out in the community discussions. A lot of the community members were really happy that at the end of this entire process, they got to see a first cut of what happened. The presentation of information back to the community to see what their interviews led up to. It opened up a lot of discussion. And that was hugely important. It gave all of us a sense to kind of take a look at, well, what's actually happening here on the ground? What's the inherited history? How are these things like working? It's not just a survey that you can send out and say, do we need more programs for X or Y? It went deeper into it and really took a look at all of the amazing things that community members are already doing. And it opened up the door for us here at Neighborhood Associates to take those ideas, right? Say, hey, look, at Fast Circle here in Washington, D.C., Marshall Heights, this is something that the resident coordinators do. We're able to share that with an idea with our communities in places like Louisville, Kentucky. One of the other communities that Neighborhood Associates supports is Berwick and Boston neighborhoods. I remember the two, Breonna Taylor lived right around that area in the same neighborhood as was. These things like really matter and help us out like a lot. It also gives us like more of a lens to say, here's, if you have a new idea, how do we actually go ahead and approach it? How do we work with the local resident informal like leaders to do it? And not just say, we've applied for a grant, here's what we have to do. Now, how do you go ahead and do it? The research that Karina did for us was to look at and said, how do we talk more about this? How do we actually get more buy-in ahead of time? Is there a better way of looking for legitimacy? How do you work at campaigns beforehand? Sure. A lot of these processes, campaigners know, but they come and go for every single election cycle and stuff afterwards. So you probably want to know what happened afterwards when the community members that participated built this huge, amazing rapport from graduate and undergraduate students, just like yourselves, who were absolutely phenomenal. You know, when we talk about mutual learning, we still have resident the tenant association and some of the residents be like, hey, are they coming back, man? And Mir and Shan were awesome. So the amount of respect that was there was huge. So after we had this, the research went, the interviews went on, and the undergraduate students presented their findings. It opened up discussion actually amongst several of the community members, the local legitimacy leaders that were there, and they got to it. Within less than a year of that informal conversation with maybe about 30 or 40 individuals and communities, Fast Circle, they invited more partners to come in and had a group specifically for men and boys. You know, here's how we fish. Here's some more connection. Here are more opportunities. They took a look at all their volunteer opportunities that they have locally nearby and said, hey, we need to get more kids involved directly to work with the older and residents. And that was a great effect. Within less than a year, you had about maybe 15 to 20 informal volunteers to about 38 to 40. And that transitions into other aspects of the work that those community leaders do. While those numbers are so small, it makes a huge difference. Fast Circle is 300 units. Household of 3, there's about 600 people that live. You have a margin of about 30 individuals who are always actively doing something, and you build up just a little bit more. It creates a huge amount of impact locally, and that's what's tough. So those are some of the examples that we have from here. And it sort of answered the question. So having the reflection come out was like great. And yes, as neighborhood associates, we are hugely a fan of the idea of asset-based community development and how to work with them. The project gave us the lens for how to do it. We're really grateful and thankful. You know, it's I spoke with 6 years in the making, 2 years, almost 2-3 years ago for the research. And I have to, of course, say thank you to my predecessor, Conrad Hatterman, who had first reached out to Karina, but he left for graduate school before he could continue. So I think that's it for me for right now. I just really wanted to say thank you again for everything. And a huge thank you to Karina, George Mason University, and the teams for providing a great example of non-extractive research that's been useful and helpful for nonprofits and change makers in the communities themselves. Thanks.
Now, I'm going to ask you 2 questions. Do I have to stand?
Yeah, please, because it will be easier to hear you.
Do you want me to fold the
If it's hard for you to stand, maybe you just sit here, maybe.
Well, if I faint, you're going to have to take me to the hospital.
I'll take it.
Your turn. It's always good to have a friend.
I hope I will continue partying in the hospital.
When this project started, I could walk. I had hair. And my chairman, a very wonderful woman, kept saying to me the same thing the Pope said to Michelangelo, when is it going to be finished? When are you going to finish this thing? And we were like, we're working on it. It's going to happen. And I hate talking to this mask. I'll turn this way so you won't get my germs. I'm also very backstage, so you shouldn't get anything. I want to thank George Mason and Karina for giving us this opportunity. The hard thing about running a nonprofit these days is, I guess we can thank Blessing Obama, is that you have to have data. Everybody wants data. Data. Data tells you. Did you know that? Data tells you everything. There's nothing more to be said or had if you don't have data. Data. I want you to get that. You're still in school. So learn how to do data, because if you don't do that, nobody will believe you. And so we write proposals and we do many things. And we're always getting, well, how do you know? Who knows this? Can you prove this? And so when this offer came along from Karina, I was like, yeah, let's really get a really established scholar to come in here and look at this. And we were like, we don't know what you're going to find. We know what we think is here. But we were delighted. And along the way, I met some wonderful graduate students, not all of them. Have not met more than I did, but wonderful young people who did the kind of work, I guess you still do it, that we used to do as graduate students. And that is grunt work, where you actually went out and you actually talked to people, and you weren't afraid to talk to people. And if you were, you didn't show them till you left that you were afraid of them, because you wanted to get responses from them. And so we were very, very pleased to have the George Mason students in. And they were very dedicated. Is this the dean? Is he still on? They were very dedicated to the project and to Karina for getting to get this accomplished. And so we are delighted with the results of this. I'm not going to try to talk a lot about the things that have already been covered, but I would like to just sort of place you in the context of where I think this puts us in AC, because we had to get something out of it, and where I think it puts you. There are hordes of sociological discussions on poor people, and there are hordes of discussions on Black people who are poor. By the way, we're all not poor, but according to the data, I guess we are. But the point is, there are lots of discussions. Now, the one thing that we wanted to do when we went into these communities was to say, well, you know, is there some other way to express who these particular people are in these communities? I will tell you this, I think since your school is getting a refresher on where you want to go and where you want to do, and I think your dean is correct, that what Karina has done is given you that step forward that is based on something very important to the sociological community. And I know this isn't a sociology-based program.
Multidisciplinary.
Multidisciplinary, okay. But what has happened with us in sociology, and I haven't been a practicing one in years, is we have been taken over by the legal people and the policy people. And so you don't hear about sociology, but you take everything from there and then you make up what you want to have. There are two books that you should be aware of that you come, let's say, in front of now, because I think the base for this kind of work was done in the 60s, and I'm not going to pronounce his name correctly, but any of you who speak Swedish may. His name was ofthe, I believe, and he wrote a book called Soul Side, where he came to Washington, D.C., and he lived for a year in a very difficult community to write this book. The book is now a classic. Soul Side was the first book that I read as a young sociology student, where I understood what the writer was attempting to do. He listened to the people that he was working with, and then he wrote down what he saw, and then he, of course, did some theory around it. But it was at the same time that the Moynihan report was already out, and there wasn't much you could do, you know, when you're up against, and I like the Moynihan report, I do want to say that, because there are some very good points to it, but not what the press did with it, and not what people who have bullhorns do with it. It had some very good points, but what Soul Side had was data which was not based on a mainframe, but based on his participant observation, which is what you did in part, and then with Karina's theory and others wrapped around it makes it a little different from his work. But that work is essential for what I think you want to do here at George Mason. That's number one, it's called Soul Side. The second book is called, and I used to commit all these to memory, but like everything else, it started to fade when I turned 65. The Code of the Street: Decency, Violence, and the Moral Life of the Inner City by Elijah Anderson. It is a fabulous book. It follows Soul Side just like a brother. They're not in tandem, but they lay out the structure. If you want to have a structure now, and we must have a structure and a dialogue to discuss our issues, and then here comes neighborhood resilience and urban conflict. Those three books, I believe, are the capacity to give you as students and George Mason something really to talk about. If you were to do those in tandem or in any way, you lay the foundation, the absolute foundation for discussing not just Blacks in poverty, but people in poverty and what they can do to help themselves, and what they do to help themselves, or what you can see if you want to see it, if you wish to see it, what you can see. And so you have these three really astounding scholars who put together the pathway for us to learn and to view with a lens into communities that are very instructive for how people live. When I first read the draft of Karina's book, I like little things. You know, I'm not a great person. I like little things. And I was struck by one of the things that the people in the communities where we work, one of the things that they liked, and it is a resilience point when you think about it, it isn't if you don't, is that the management of the housing area, the housing complexes send birthday cards. Each individual in, look at me, there's 6,000 people to sing happy birthday. And they reported this to Korean, like, oh my God, this is wonderful. I love these people. Now you get birthday cards, and the first thing you do is open it. I need money out. Where's the $20? You know, where's, no, I guess now it's like $100. In my day it was $20. Where's $100? I need. They were so overjoyed. My understanding that just getting that somebody knew me, knew my name, sent me a card to my address and said, happy birthday. Those are the small things that we miss in life. That resilience really is built on these small moments of excitement that people feel inside, that you see them. And so when you see people this summer saying, call my name, they may not have known what they were talking about, but what they were saying is, see me, I'm here. You cannot do this without understanding I exist. That's all it's saying. Very simple thing. And when I saw that, I told the staff, I said, this is going to be a good study. Because what this team has done, they have looked at the heart of what a community is. Not what you want it to be. You know, no, it's not fancy. If you went there, you wouldn't probably want to live there. Maybe you would. It's not fancy. It's not great. But it's good. It's decent. It's moral. Drive-by shootings happen? Yes. It's still moral. We think we're a moral country. We shoot, bomb, and do everything else we want to. But we don't say we're not moral, do we? I just haven't heard anybody recently say we're not. So we give ourselves license to be. But in America, the poor aren't given a license to be. They're given a license to do what I say do. And if you don't, forget you. Now, I'm preaching and I'm going to move on with it. But that particular piece was something I told my chairman about. And even she said, is that important? I said, absolutely. And then she said, of course it is. It shows we care. I said, it shows you care. You want your rent, yes. They need their rent to keep going, but they also need to have validation that they care about the people who are in their community. And those people have to know that you care about them. Now, Karina mentioned something that we're getting ready to do, and this book is going to be central to that. We have started a campaign called Public Kinship. And it's really a very simple campaign. And it is a campaign that some people think is a little too simple because it only requires one thing. It requires that you, the individual, do something. I used to work at Kellogg Foundation for many years in the leadership area. And the one thing that I finally got really tired of was funding leadership programs for people. You know why? But sometimes I was giving people this money, my thought was, you could not lead a cat out the front door. Why are you getting a grant to lead someone? And then these long stories and oriented, I want to lead. I think leaders are not born, they are made, and they're leading. And then the thing is, leading them where? With what are you leading them? We just had a leader. Thank you. Where to? Got one now. We're looking great. Leadership is something that you. So public kinship is what I do. How I treat myself and how I treat you. That's all. You just make the commitment to do good things. You make a commitment, and this sounds somewhat religious, to do unto others. Do you know the rest of that? Every religion, I looked it up, every major religion, even minor ones, there is some statement that says that same thing. Buddhist, Taoist, I don't care who you are. Muslim, Jew, whatever. It's there. All that is required of us as individuals is to treat each the same. And so what we have started is public kinship. How do we take ourselves and believe in ourselves? Or will you believe in yourself to treat? You really want to scream at people when you walk down the street? No, you don't want that. So you wouldn't scream at other people when you walk down the street. The idea, there's 7 different components. I'm not going to do that for you. It'd be like being in a class, and I won't do that. I have been in a class since, I don't know, since Stockburn, since I was a child. That's when I was in the classroom. But it's been a long time. I was at Georgetown. And I will tell you this. When I walked into the classroom, I was 27 years old. And I was teaching the sociology class. It was a huge, huge, huge room with these very sophisticated looking students. And I was sitting in the front because I didn't want to get up. So when I got up to the stand, some guy in the back said, "You have got to be kidding." I knew from that forward day, but I said, all right, no one, I look too young. So I grew a huge beard so I could go in there and I would be questioned about how I looked, even though I let my afro come down quite a bit because I was getting a job. But I mean, I still looked like I was 13. So one of the things is how you see people. And so public kinship is all about that. I see you, you see me. And then how do you exchange that? And there's 7 pieces to it. If any of you are interested, I'd be glad to get it to you. We are going to do a big national program starting in December. I'm going to be speaking on at TED, and I'll be glad to include you and let you know. I got a thing back from them today, and they said, now I'm 75,000 years old. And I said, oh, you speak very well. And I wanted to say, thanks. You know, it's so gratifying to know that after going to school 152 years, that you speak very well. So thank you. I appreciate it. I'll take anything you give me. But what I'm trying to tell you is that I think public kinship is the only way we're going to get out of this situation, where each individual takes responsibility for himself, not someone else, himself. And if we take responsibility for self, the rest will take care of itself. I am going to leave you there, and I'm going to leave you by saying, thank you, George Mason. Thank you for what you have done for us. Thank you. We have students go, thank you, because I didn't need it.
Thank you very much. And I'm so happy to have to my colleagues here today, Professor Rich Rubinstein.
Yeah, Rich, you had to say nice things.
I think one of the students commented and asked what the second book was called. Yona was asking. We saw his
The second book,
The second book you
The
mentioned.
Code of the Streets.
Yeah, Code of the Streets by Elijah Anderson.
Yeah.
Okay, good. And thank you for putting me together with these 2 very important authors.
Well, that's where you belong now.
I'm
See?
very
So they're going to be
glad.
shooting at you from now on.
So thank you for having me, and let me say how excited I am to be reading this book. In fact, I'm almost finished with it, and how much I appreciate it in several ways that I want to mention. But before I do that, I just want to say what a treat it is to be here and to be in the same room with Bobby Austin, who has been a friend for a long time. We haven't seen much of each other lately, but that's a mistake which we were going to correct. We have mutual friends who we love dearly, and great. I've always considered him a wise man and a leader. And also my dear colleague Karina, who's written this book, who is in some ways the kind of person that it's why you come to a school like this, I think, just to meet someone with Karina's depth of understanding and breadth of interests. Karina and I have been on we've been on panels together on I can't tell you how many different kinds of subjects and different kinds of places. We were in at Johns Hopkins together years ago talking about the conflict in Ukraine, which she knows something about. And when I see her move and expand her interest to the point where she's going from being a social psychologist to being a political philosopher, where she's going from being a person interested in international affairs to also, this without giving anything up, but including domestic affairs, and to write a book of this kind of sensitivity and depth about urban neighborhoods in our own part of the world, it's really thrilling. For those of us who hoped from the beginning that this school would be a place that would study conflict and not be another international affairs center only, that we would continue to pay attention to international conflict and intranational conflict, but we would also pay attention to conflict in our own backyard. And in fact, some of you may not know that one of the reasons we came down here to Arlington from Fairfax was to be closer to Washington, D.C., which for a long time meant virtually nothing. Meant, we got to eat at some better restaurants. The kinds of communications with local communities that we originally hoped that we would have, did not have for a long time. And now they're developing. And the kind of work that you, students, and Karina have done are essential to that development. So it's really the realization of a dream for a lot of us. I want to say a couple of things quickly about the book, which I had a great deal of fun reading. One, that the same movement from international to domestic affairs is what is being done in the book. Bobby talked about data being important. Data is important, but the data is data. It's not international. It's not domestic. It's both. It's all of the above. And Karina moves really, I would say, brilliantly from dealing with indices of aspects of resilience in foreign countries and non-American countries, foreign cities, to dealing with local neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., Virginia. And she does that with cultural sensitivity. She's not assuming that every place is the same or that all cultures are the same, but she's focusing on relevant similarities in a way which is, in some ways, I think, a model of the way this kind of research should be done. Second thing I want to say about this book is that it deals with a question that's dear to my heart, and it makes progress in dealing with a very difficult situation. Bobby will remember that, he'll know what I'm talking about when I say that when I first got involved with urban affairs in Chicago, what I found myself more and more drawn to talking about and involving myself with groups that were trying to do something about was what was then called community control. And the notion that the racial uprisings of the 60s, which I walked into, I blundered into when I went to Chicago, that the racial uprisings of the 60s were in some ways aimed at establishing community control, that they weren't revolutionary. They weren't revolutionary uprising aimed at seizing power in Washington or any place else. They were aimed at achieving some kind of control by local people over their own communities. And they were a protest both against the dehumanizing conditions of life under which people were living and still live in many places, but also they were a protest against the loss of community autonomy, community control. At the time when we were involved in that movement, in the Black Power movement, really in Chicago, there was no there was no contradiction, or seemed to be no contradiction, between community control and much broader kinds of system change. And the idea that people needed to control their own communities was not considered adverse in any respect to the idea that the system, the way we were doing business in America, the way American capitalism was being managed, the way American democracy was being managed, the way American imperialism was extending itself around the world, that these things were all related. Martin Luther King knew very well that they were related, and so did our friends in Chicago. But then something happened to disassociate system change in the broader sense from community control, local control by people of their own communities. And without getting into all the details, which would take much too long, I can say that that over time, the ambition to change the system suddenly and dramatically was given up, was modified, and then by many people given up, although it's still a live issue for many of us. But on the community control side, community control suffered. It went through a stage. Bobby mentioned the Moynihan report. Well, it went through a stage in which government agencies tried during the Great Society period to institutionalize community control through a doctrine which is called maximum feasible participation, to empower community organizations, which ran into a stonewall of opposition from established organizations, elite organizations, which didn't want communities to have that kind of control over their own lives, and blocked it. Moynihan himself then wrote a book called Maximum Feasible Misunderstanding about how that happened. At a certain time, after the 80s and 90s had gone by, kind of the 21st century version of community control was launched under the banner of resilience. And resilience, as Karina so correctly points out, was really part of the platform of elite institutions interested in what they call development, economic development. And resilience was originally framed in such a way as to, you might call it tamed community control. It was community control, but under conditions in which the neoliberal hegemony would not be challenged at all. And one of the wonderful things I think about Karina's book is that she recognizes that quite clearly. She talks about it very frankly. And then she asserts, but wait a minute, there are kinds of resilience that escape that sort of critique, the critique that critical resilience studies offers. There are kinds of resilience which aren't necessarily means of empowering neoliberal elites, but actually maybe means of empowering communities. I think Bobby has devoted his life to trying to achieve. So that is an exciting. Right, I'm almost finished anyway. But that's an exciting aspect of this book, is that it tries to demonstrate the compatibility of neighborhood resilience with movements for system change that are serious. And I can't say, and I'm sure Karina wouldn't say, that she solves all the problems that formulation presents. But what she does do is to establish a kind of an agenda for further research, also for further political action, aimed at answering questions like what kind of neighborhood resilience is consistent with or promotes system change? What kind of neighborhood so-called resilience it doesn't? That's exactly the kind of inquiry which I think helps us in this school define a research agenda for ourselves and also a practice agenda. So I think Karina's book does us an enormous favor and puts us on the road to better and more radical research, which we're all very grateful.
Thank you, Karina.
I have to,
There's a few people.
there's some more people. Yeah, let me do it. Thank you very much. I didn't.
Just hit mute.
What?
Karina, you just gonna mute.
Mute all.
Mute all. Yeah,
Okay.
that means anyone that coming in, they'll be muted. Mute just them, not here.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you very much, Rich. Thank you very much. And my other wonderful colleague and friend, Dr. Rosberg.
Thank you very much. Well, this is just a pleasure to.
Sorry, they have to
Celebrate.
leave. Yeah.
I
for
know
class.
there's other events. This is just a pleasure to be celebrating your work. And I think many of you know that every few years, Karina produces an amazing book. And the books are characterized by obviously deep research, obviously unreported issue, but there's something else. There's a definite kind of radical creativity that is reflected. And I didn't read you saying I was creative here in the intro, but it really is. And the radical creativity, and first of all, it's just such an honor and benefit to be a colleague of Karina's. And kind of, I try to ask, what's next? What should I do? But the radical creativity, I think, comes out in a couple of ways. And let me just say a few words very briefly about how the book is situated in the field. And Rich Rubenstein and the other speakers, I think, began and mentioned it. First, the book is obviously in the tradition of the local term, that this is a very important transition from top-down, state-determined matters of war and peace. It's a local turn, obviously locally. And yet it adds what I find particularly exciting. It is so deeply human. It's data, but it's data that really goes to the core of who the people are, I'm guessing. I didn't know them. The idea of combining police strategy and conflict prevention with bake sales, that somehow the bake sales, the calling up and going to the movies is relevant. This is part of the practices that we read about. That then intersects with, being careful, watching your neighbors, walking home at night, and so on. That this is a deeply human and radical view, that kind of intersection, which I see also as creativity. Second point is that on the surface, resilience is kind of a capacity on the surface. It's this set of practices, of course, but I look at it as much more than that. That resilience is the frame or the entry into the most important issues in our field. That is, it's a perspective. It's not just a capacity. It's a way of thinking and a way of situating topics about which we're quite familiar, but flipping them. So for those of you who know Bourdieu, it's deeply Pierre Bourdieu, but turning him on his head. For those of you, you better know Johann Galtung. It is so much about power dynamics, structural violence, the four-loop model that you saw, and I hope you memorize, is all about so many of the issues of overcoming structural violence without revolution. And to me, on the issue of structural violence, of which we have an expert sitting right here who's written eloquently about that, that's the biggest challenge, in my opinion, with structural violence, structural theories, is how do you change structure without a firing squad? Lenin didn't think it was possible, and obviously we want to think it's possible, but this is how you do it, is deeply, radically humanizing the community. So I see this as radically transformative and a whole perspective for basically engaging in our field and being immersed in our field. The final thing I just want to say is I felt a paradox in the perspective. The paradox is obviously focus on the local, micro perspective, bake sales, card games, and so on. But the paradox is that the local is situated in a space of deep, intense communication in many cases. Other communities find out. So other communities find out. There's obviously layers and layers of communication we all know about. The word spreads, media, friends in other neighborhoods, whatever it is, and it then becomes non-local. So I see the power, if local neighborhoods have power, then it's also the power to communicate and to spread, as it were, their, I would call it wisdom, as we just heard eloquently about that wisdom, about kinship, that this power becomes an entry to other locals, which is, as it were, expansive to the non-local. So I see a paradox in the process, in the empowerment of the local, which is very exciting. So anyway, congratulations. This is a serious must read for everybody. So.
Thank you very much. I really touched to hear such wonderful, awesome experts like you, honestly, from Bobby and Rich, who done this work for really important, significant, groundbreaking work on structural violence, for them who really done a lot of work on philosophy of local and philosophy of macro and micro dynamics. Thank you very much. I really appreciate, and the most happy for me to hear how book is actually used. Thank you, Afnan and Bobby, for really bringing it into the world and making the world a better place. I don't know if you were able to see what is the devoted, the book is devoted to people devoted to making their neighborhoods more resilient and thriving. So it's really to people. And I hope, because I met so many wonderful people during this research. So I know we went a little bit over, but if any questions and any comments and anyone wants to have, who is here, and also you can see what is there in the chat. I know, but
I have a question.
yes, absolutely.
And I'm sorry if you covered this and I just missed or wasn't paying attention. But when you were talking about like how the what the girls were given opportunities through Girl Scouts, and they were given more opportunities for community inclusion. Did you find out why the boys weren't given more opportunities?
Yes, because women were the ones who were leading.
Okay, got you, that makes
Because
sense.
mothers know how to entertain girls, but had no idea how to entertain boys.
Huh,
They tried, but they failed.
got you, okay.
And inclusion, and we actually were working with Afnan writing the proposal how to include fathers. And majority of, not majority, but in some neighborhoods, pretty big portion, 30 to 40% were single mothers. It's also very, very important factor in it. But again, those who have legitimacy, they define resilience and they define inclusion and exclusion. For me, it was really digging deeper into microdynamics of identity and legitimacy and power, and see how it's happening that people actually re-establish their legitimacy, re-establish their position and power in communities by excluding others.
Mhm,
They didn't want to exclude boys, but
Yeah.
it's happening as a social process.
got you.
That's why Adnan will be working on this, establishing new programs, how to include boys. And a lot of things which I didn't cover here, but were very interesting to see, for example, a lot of motivation and energy among third generation African Americans in comparison with longer residents. You can see more energy because they came, they want change, they brought change, they expect, they have bigger motivation and expectation. Most of active members of communities were actually third generation immigrants. So also very interesting dynamic.
I guess to add on to your first portion of the question, one of the things that we were kind of asking, talking about right away, was like, okay, there is this gap, right?
Yeah.
Why is it? And I think just like some of the samples of the interviews that came out, remember, like Bobby talked about some of these communities, right? If you read the book or take a look at it, two of these communities made national news back in the 80s to mid 90s. How does Parkside and Parkside neighborhood, which is about to become probably some of the most expensive real estate in the next 30 years in DC, there's more space to develop. It was back then in the late 80s to the early 90s was the largest open air drug market in all of the continental US. And then in Carver Terrace, the same thing with Vietnam. One summer, you had 49 homicides. So as these things like cascaded through the memory of time, even for generations that weren't there firsthand for it, there's a feeling of fear that some people I remembered for young men. And there were people that were coming in, returning citizens, we call them now. So you have that weight kind of like over there in the field. So one example is something that very stable, have been there for a generation, like Trina said. And that was like something that we actually didn't know or understand that, how that came out. That was a huge, like, oh, okay. And then when we were inside that room, like I said, like, the individuals that came out from all their communities, asked them, like, okay, what do they take away from this, right? I don't know, people, they should just go on and do whatever they were doing before, and people are hesitant to change. The exact opposite. They didn't necessarily work with the neighborhood associates directly, they talked amongst themselves, and they worked with the rest of the coordinator and said, like, you know what? Yeah, maybe I did think that. They found ways of saying, we want to be more supportive, more inclusive of young men and boys, and they started actively doing so. That thing of these small town associations, small groups of engaged citizens resident, they saw it, and they started working with around it to do something about it, right? That shift in thinking the lens for it. That was again, that was a huge win. If nothing else, in as like someone like in the back end of the office and the low end of the totem pole, that's like a huge benefit and gain that was there. This perspective and the sample for it. So that thing was huge, right? And we look at that we have this gap. But that gap wasn't arrived at by data analytics of saying how many people hate boys or dislike boys. Of course, you code that or you need to for survey. It was through the news. And it was like, oh, it's so respectful. They didn't know much.
Yeah, this was very interesting that they speak about there are those in one community where people relocated from shelters for some period before they moved. So it was basically it was microdynamic of refugees within the community. And you have to see like how they were speaking. Look at them. They do not care about their children. Look at the teeth of these children. They do not feed them well. They are not taking care about their education. So really concentration on children, how they can help them. It was actually very interesting discussion and how the not private, how they call the schools, oh my gosh, not public schools, but charter schools. They all wanted charter schools. They saw much more better difference for their children in charter schools and public schools. So there were a lot of these small dynamics which is there in the book, but sometimes controversial. And for me, it was interesting to bring this data. For example, they were all against food stamps. In many cases, so food stamps decrease your dignity. Food stamps do not allow you to work. So very controversial discussion which brought from this discussion. They told we want job, we don't want food stamps.
Do you want to show, you've shown the results to the people you interviewed, right?
Yes, we
And
did. We
What do you, can this be expanded to other communities, do you think?
Well, it could be. Everything has to do with money. But one way we can expand Karina's work and the book is with something starting called public kinship clubs. And a part of that curriculum and understanding would be to get this book and write up some kind of, small summary of it. And then we have something we are now opening soon called the public kinship think tank. Yeah, I could even think about think tank. And we certainly will have her on that think tank. And this will be with scholars and people around the US, but particularly in both the UK and in France. So, yeah.
And I think the one thing that we really hope would happen is if there's any way to engage policymakers in the local area. Because again, like we were one example of hey, look at this, right? Refugees now have something in writing that reflects their voice and their perspective, which is huge. There's like about 100 years worth of history inside here, 30 years of lived history at least. That in itself is important. But also just what everyone here mentioned about the new way of looking at policy. I think you'll have receptive audiences, at least in the cities of Baltimore and DC, in taking a look at how this works, right? Washington, D.C. was 100 resilient city underneath their Brown founders of administration. They were slow to work to get their chief resilience officer inside. We had talked to them earlier on how to support the social dynamic pieces for it.
Now I want to add a little bit. One of the things this will help with is redefining resilience, because what governments are talking about is, can you withstand a flood? And they don't seem to be able to get beyond that. Do you need a better flood wall? Well, yes, obviously you need flood walls, but you must do something about how people are part of this process. And I think with a scholar, not us, but a scholar talking about it, we could engage our local authorities. And I think they would listen, that you have got to expand, not change, but expand your definition of what resilience is and what it looks like. It may not look like what you think resilience is, but let's name those 5 or 6 things that you talk about, that are resilient elements for community, any community or family or whatever.
Yeah, I think that just to conclude, because we are around, but just to conclude, I think that first of all, nothing is new, as Rich told. It was already conceptual idea was there as community control, and I so deeply based all my work and understanding what Rich is doing on structural violence. But in the same time, it's a time came that people become more sensitive to idea of resilience. So that's why it's just a useful concept to promote exactly the same ideas: empowerment of community, respect for communities, respect for local knowledge, not coming there and teaching them what to do and telling them what to do. So thank you very much. Thank you for everyone who stayed to the very end. And we hope to continue this work and hope to have more events with DC government and have presentations with DC government and see how we can expand this work beyond.
The film. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Thank you so
Okay,
much.
thank you very much. Thank you. We are finishing here. Thank you. Very much. I really appreciate you coming here, my dear friends. And all my dear students. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone online. Molly, very happy to see you there.
I don't think she has.
I don't know if she can. No, she cannot.
They have teachers, though.
Coming out.
About work.
Okay, bye-bye.